Now, since everyone's gonna say, why don't you ever do a pull in the truck, I guess we'll do one today. Try and roll into first easy. Howdy, my friends, and welcome to the garage. I'm Luke, Thunderhead2D9 on YouTube here, and in this video today, we're going to go over one of the most overlooked and neglected pieces on tuning a carbureted engine. It's actually something that you need to look into long before you take out a screwdriver or a vacuum gauge and start fooling with your carburetor itself. Like I said, it's extremely overlooked, and I see people time and time again chasing fueling issues that could all be traced back to this point. So before you do anything else, this is something you need to look into. So the topic of our discussion today is fuel pressure. Now, there's a dynamic relationship between fuel pressure and the overall functionality of the carburetor, and we're going to review that today with the help of our 74 F100 being our test mule. We have a wideband air fuel gauge and then a Summit carburetor with glass sight plugs in it so we can see where our fuel level is. And basically we're just going to adjust our fuel pressure and watch how that affects our fueling on our engine. So with that, let's jump right in. All right, so while I got the truck warming up here behind me and we're waiting for the air fuel ratio to normalize for our test, I'm going to play this little clip for you here. It's from a fella who's on my Facebook forum. That's a carb and tuning Facebook group that we have. And basically, this is his experience with a mechanical fuel pump, and as he works through the RPM, what his fuel pressure does. So, pretty interesting. Let's take a look at that really quick.
All right, guys, I installed a not-so-permanent fuel pressure gauge just to see what my fuel pressure is at, because I had heard that they don't actually produce what they say they are. And this mechanical pump is supposed to be at like 5 pounds or so as an OE replacement to the regular pump that's on there. And this gauge is showing 8. It's hovering at 8, and this is at idle. So obviously as RPMs go up, we're almost at 9. I mean, hovering 9, maybe a little over 9. I do have a fuel pressure regulator on the way, and I was going to install these in tandem. But since I got this today, I figured I'd put it on. And yeah, it is way over, and I think that's why my carb is running rich, cruising down the road, because of the fuel pressure. So.
All right, so as you saw, that fuel pressure was walking all over the place, and I see this a lot of times with mechanical fuel pumps. Now, what you need to understand about a carburetor, and this is very important, is that a carburetor is a static metering device. The more consistent you can keep your inputs to a carburetor, the more consistent your output is going to be, the more consistent your performance is going to be, and the reliability of your tune, and so on. So, you know, if we can mitigate those anomalies with fuel pressure and everything, it goes a long way. But the truck's good and warmed up now, so let's mess with our fuel pressure and see how our carburetor responds to that. All right, so now getting to the exciting stuff. Before we change anything, we're gonna get a reading on all of our baselines. So you see right now, we're idling with an air fuel ratio of about 14:1, good manifold vacuum, about a 750, 800 RPM idle on this manual F100 here. Get a look at our fuel pressure and our float height now. Our engine's pretty good and happy here. Bet you we can even balance a nickel on it if we're really good. If the fan quits blowing it over. There we go. So anyway, that's a good baseline for us here. Now if I can manage to not put my hand in the fan, I'm going to shut the valve off on my return line, and basically without having the bypass, we're effectively eliminating my bypass regulator, and now we are on the full pressure of the pump. obviously 3/4 of the sight glass is notably higher. You look at our air-fuel ratio. The exhaust tone of the truck has definitely changed. It's almost more gurgly in a way. Getting in here. It looks like our air-fuel ratio now, from boosting our fuel pressure, has gone up to, down rather. It's dropped a full point down to the low 13s, upper 12s, all the way from about 14.5. All right, let's get the pressure off this thing. That poor little Summit carburetor. Super impressed with that little guy, that she can hold up to all that fuel pressure. So as you can see from our air fuel gauge in the truck, that a variability in fuel pressure actually adds to a variability in our air fuel ratio. This is all really pretty simple to mitigate, and we're gonna take a look at why this is actually happening in the carburetor, what the fuel pressure is actually changing, and then we'll see how to correct this so we don't have to worry about it anymore. So in order for us to understand why variability in fuel pressure causes a variability in our overall fueling curve and affects our air-fuel ratio, we first need to have a very basic understanding of how a carburetor functions. Now, really, essentially, they're very basic. They work off of the Bernoulli theorem, which more or less states that a liquid will move from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. You know, duh, everything's gonna reach equilibrium. Now, a carburetor takes advantage of this and takes it a step further and uses what is called the Venturi effect, where as air passes through the Venturi, it's choked down, airspeed will increase, and actually pressure will drop. Well, all around us, everything is actually under pressure. Atmospheric pressure at sea level is about 14.7 or so. So in this area of the Venturi, where this airspeed increases and pressure drops, it will draw fuel from the fuel bowl out and then through the booster into our Venturi to be atomized with air and go along its merry way. Now, where fuel pressure plays into this whole equation is its relationship between the float and where the fuel level sits in relation to it. So just to give you an example here, as you increase pressure, in order for that float to do its job and close off the needle and seat and regulate the fuel coming into the bowl, it has to push back with the same force as the force pushing on it. So as you increase pressure, that float is going to sit lower and lower in the fuel level. So if you think of a boat, the more weight you load into a boat, the more people you put on the boat, the lower that boat is going to sit in the water line. Now, a float in a carburetor is essentially the same thing, but on a float bowl, it has a static volume. The float itself has a static volume. So as you push that float down, that fuel level, if with all things equal, is actually going to rise in the float bowl. Now, this is important because the fuel level in the bowl has a direct relationship to how it interacts with our Venturi effect in the low pressure area that draws the fuel up out of the float bowl and out of the boosters. Basically, the carburetor is designed to see fuel at a certain level for all the calibrations to be correct. If you start messing with this, you start messing with the overall fuel curve that the carburetor was designed for, and you kind of get the circuits out of whack. So, if you have different fuel pressure, you can adjust for, a static fuel pressure. But if you start having variability in this fuel pressure, you now have a bunch of variability in your fuel curve, and you will never be able to tune those issues out. It'll just be Band-Aid after Band-Aid, and you'll just be chasing your tail forever. All right, so I'm sure at this point a lot of you guys already know where I'm going with this, but the easiest way to mitigate all of these fuel pressure related issues is to simply run a fuel pressure regulator if I don't drop it on the ground. So there's several different versions of these out on the market. I got another one here I'll show you in a second. This is the one that I prefer, and I'll leave the link to it below, so you can take a look at it. But it's just a normal 4.5 to 9 PSI adjustable regulator for a deadhead style system. So that means you guys with mechanical fuel pumps, this will work great for you, where you can keep consistent fuel pressure to your carburetor. Now, in our other video, we talked about Edelbrock carburetors specifically. You can't see the fuel level in the float bowl, so you want to be very specific with where you set that fuel pressure to. So these are extremely important with an Edelbrock, and if you have variability in your fuel pressure, even with a Holley, you do need to run a regulator. So these are the ones that I like, and I'll leave a link to the gauge below too that I prefer. And, you know, it's worked out pretty well for me in the past. Now this is the other style of fuel pressure regulator that you'll see out there on the market, kind of this dial style. And I'm not the biggest fan of these. Oftentimes they start to leak right around the dial, right onto your intake manifold or where you have it, you know, peels all your engine paint off. In extreme cases, causes engine fires, which no one really wants to have. So, you know, I generally try and avoid these. Also, the thing to watch out for if you already have one is that the little tick marks, it's labeled 1 through 5 or so, and they really don't correlate to any fuel pressure. So if you put a fuel pressure gauge in line, you know, the 5 set point on the regulator does not correlate to 5 PSI. So, you know, really I prefer to use the other ones, but you guys are free to do whatever you want to do. That's just my suggestion. So there's a huge discrepancy in the automotive world between liquid-filled gauges and non-liquid filled gauges. So I'm going to show you what the issue is with this and why this can give you some bad readings. Now we have this thing pressurized with our coolant pressure tester here, and so we have a gauge on both sides that should be showing the same pressure. So basically what we're going to do is quickly heat this up, and you know, in theory this is similar to what you would have under the hood of an engine, but just at an accelerated pace. All right, so about 20 seconds with the lighter on the bottom of the gauge there, and you can see it's not that hot. You know, I can hold my hand on it here without any issue. And our gauge on the left is still reading 10 PSI, and our gauge on the right is now reading somewhere below 7 PSI. Now this is concerning because this could lead someone to inadvertently make a misadjustment to their fuel pressure regulator. And you know, if you thought you had 7 PSI and you were all the way up at 10 PSI, you know, on a lot of carburetors, that's enough to blow open the needle and seat and flood the engine out. So as folks make adjustments to their engine with these liquid-filled gauges under hood, you know, over time with engine heat, they'll slowly show less and less pressure as they heat up. And then, you know, again, you start making misadjustments. A fuel pressure gauge is nothing but, you know, a gauge of differential pressure. And what you have happening, since these are sealed, is you have pressure on the back side, which is your fuel side, but then as it heats up, this oil inside will expand and it's pushing back against the gauge. So it's pushing back with about 3 PSI as our pressure on it is about 10, so we're only reading about 7 PSI. Now this isn't to say there's anything inherently wrong with liquid-filled gauges. This one I have here in my hand is an industrial style liquid-filled gauge. Now you'll notice it says that once it's installed, you want to cut this little nipple off, and basically all that is a purge, so that if the gauge does heat up, it can purge this oil out of the top and it won't distort the overall pressure reading. Now again, on the automotive one, we don't have this, and I assume it's because they don't want oil running all over the top of folks' engines, but because of this, you know, it really renders them effectively useless in my opinion, and I always recommend not running an oil-filled gauge for this reason. Well, all right, my friends, that's going to do it for me today. I hope you enjoyed, and more importantly, I hope you learned something. So the whole reason I do this channel is that when I started out and I was young and trying to figure this stuff out for myself, I had to sift through so much bad info to figure out what worked and what didn't. And basically I've just tried to create a place for you guys that I wish I would have had 10 years ago when I started in on all this. So if you have any tech questions or anything, post them below. I'll try and get back to you guys. Again, I run a Facebook group, Thunderhead 289 Carbon Engine Tech and Tune Forum, where, you know, I don't know everything, but what I do know, I'll be happy to provide to you, and hopefully it'll be helpful. So with that, I'll catch you guys later. Take care and have a good evening. Thanks again.